Jim was in the middle of reading poetry to a headstone when the security guard finally decided to break the silence. What happened next left thousands of fans speechless when the guard's testimony surfaced 50 years later. October 1969 through March 1971, Hollywood Forever Cemetery, just blocks from Paramount Studios. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., Morrison would climb the fence near the south gate and walk alone through the darkness to the same grave, Rudolph Valentino's marble tomb. The cemetery was wrapped in fog and silence, empty except for the distant sound of traffic on Santa Monica Boulevard. But what none of them knew was that Morrison wasn't just visiting a grave. He was performing. Night watchman Robert Chen watched from behind the maintenance building as Morrison sat cross-legged, drinking from a flask, reciting his own unpublished poetry to the silent tomb. Chen later reported Morrison often wept, his voice breaking as he whispered about fame, death, and the price of being worshipped. The person Morrison was really talking to wasn't Valentino. It was himself. Chen documented in his security logs that Morrison would ask the same question every night, his voice desperate in the darkness. When does the fame stop hurting? Before we continue with what Chen discovered during those 2 years of midnight surveillance, make sure you subscribe, because what Morrison was actually doing at that cemetery connects directly to his death in Paris 18 months later, and the truth has been hidden in security archives for half a century. The pattern started in October 1969, just months after the disastrous Miami concert that led to Morrison's obscenity conviction and the beginning of his spiral into deeper alcoholism. Chen, a Korean War veteran working the graveyard shift at Hollywood Forever for 15 years, first noticed the intruder when motion sensors triggered near the south fence. He grabbed his flashlight and followed a tall figure moving with purpose through the rows of graves, not stumbling like a typical trespasser, but walking as if he knew exactly where he was going. The figure stopped at Valentino's tomb, sat down, pulled out a whiskey bottle and a notebook, then began reading aloud in a deep, theatrical voice that carried through the silent cemetery like a ghost speaking to ghosts. Chen stood behind a large angel statue for 20 minutes, listening to fragments of poetry about masks and performances, about becoming someone else for strangers, about losing yourself in the character you created until you couldn't remember who you'd been before the spotlight found you. The voice cracked several times, pausing for quiet sobbing that came from somewhere deeper than ordinary sadness, from a well of loneliness that seemed bottomless. When the reading stopped, the figure took a long drink and spoke directly to the tomb in a conversational tone, as if addressing an old friend. When does the fame stop hurting, Rudy? You've been dead 40 years. Does it still hurt you? Chen made a decision in that moment that would define his approach to the next 2 years. This wasn't vandalism or teenage mischief. This was someone genuinely suffering, using the cemetery as a confessional, the dead as witnesses to pain that couldn't be shared with the living. He quietly retreated to the security office, logged the incident as a false alarm triggered by wind, and decided to simply observe rather than intervene. 2 weeks later, enough moonlight allowed Chen to see the intruder's face clearly as he climbed the fence. The long, dark hair, sharp features, leather jacket, and distinctive profile were unmistakable to anyone who'd seen a Doors album cover. Jim Morrison. The recognition complicated everything. This was a celebrity whose presence could become a media circus if discovered, could bring reporters and fans and chaos to a place meant to be peaceful and respectful of the dead. Chen understood Morrison was coming to the cemetery precisely because it was one of the few places in Los Angeles where he could be alone, where fame couldn't follow, where the dead didn't care that he was the Lizard King, or that teenage girls screamed his name, or that he'd been arrested in Miami. The dead just listened, and listening without judgment was apparently something Morrison desperately needed. So Chen made another decision. He would keep this secret, even from his wife and fellow security guards. He began carrying a small notebook of his own, documenting Morrison's visits with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd learned in the military. Date, time of arrival, duration of stay, weather conditions, Morrison's apparent emotional state, fragments of whatever Chen could hear from his observation posts. Over 26 months, Chen filled 3 notebooks with observations, creating an accidental archive of Morrison's psychological disintegration that would remain hidden in a storage box in his garage for 46 years. The visits followed a predictable pattern, with occasional variations. Morrison arrived between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m., always alone, carrying alcohol, sometimes whiskey, sometimes wine, occasionally vodka. He would sit cross-legged against Valentino's marble base and drink and read and talk for 30 minutes to 3 hours, depending on his emotional state and level of intoxication. What struck Chen most forcefully was the consistency of Morrison's questions to the dead star. Every single visit, without exception, Morrison asked variations of the same fundamental question about fame and suffering. Did you know who you really were, Rudy? Or did you die still wearing the mask? How many of those women who threw themselves on your coffin actually knew you? Was it worth it, being loved by millions who loved a lie? The questions revealed a man grappling with an identity crisis so profound that it had driven him to seek counsel from someone who'd been dead for 40 years. Someone who couldn't answer, but who'd faced a similar burden during his brief life. Valentino, the silent screen idol whose funeral had drawn over 100,000 mourners, who'd been mobbed wherever he went, who'd received thousands of love letters from women who'd fallen for the sheikh he played on screen rather than the man he was in life, represented a kind of precedent for the particular hell Morrison was experiencing. But Valentino hadn't survived the fame. He'd died at 31, just 4 years older than Morrison during these cemetery visits, and maybe that was the real answer Morrison was seeking, written in marble and silence. Chen noticed Morrison's visits became more frequent and longer in duration after particularly difficult events in his public life. After the Miami trial dates, after bad reviews in the music press, after concerts that ended in chaos or cancellation, Morrison would spend extra time at the cemetery, drinking more heavily, his voice angrier or more broken, depending on the specific trauma he was processing. In December 1970, after a disastrous concert in New Orleans, where Morrison was so drunk he could barely stand, and the show was stopped after 20 minutes, he came to the cemetery 5 nights in a row, each visit lasting over 2 hours, his monologues to Valentino becoming increasingly incoherent and desperate, the words slurring together into a stream of consciousness that spoke of endings and escape. But there were also nights when Morrison seemed calmer, more philosophical than despairing. On these occasions, he would read poetry that sounded more finished and polished, less like raw emotional vomiting, and more like actual literary work that he might have been preparing for publication. Chen, who had no formal education beyond high school, but had developed a love of reading during long nights in foxholes during the Korean War, found himself genuinely moved by some of what he overheard. Morrison was clearly a talented writer with a real gift for language and imagery, and it seemed tragic that this gift was being overshadowed by the scandal and spectacle of his public life, performed only for an audience of marble and a security guard hiding behind monuments. One night in March 1971, Morrison brought something different to the cemetery. Instead of just his usual bottle and notebook, he carried a small portable tape recorder, the kind that was becoming popular for journalists and students. Chen watched as Morrison set up the device on the ground, in front of Valentino's tomb, pressed record, and began to speak directly into the microphone. This wasn't poetry reading or drunken questioning. This was deliberate, planned, something Morrison wanted preserved. Chen moved closer than usual, risking detection, driven by an urgent curiosity about what could be so important that Morrison would record it in a cemetery at 3 a.m. What he heard made his blood run cold. Morrison was recording what sounded like a goodbye, a final statement addressed to everyone and no one, a valediction that assumed he wouldn't be around much longer to speak for himself. Morrison talked about Paris, about plans to leave Los Angeles, and everything it represented, about hoping that distance and anonymity might save him from the fate he felt closing in. He talked about Pamela, about loving someone who was as lost as he was, about two drowning people trying to save each other and both going under. He talked about the Doors, about the music that had started as liberation and become another cage, about Ray and Robbie and John, who deserved better than a frontman who was drinking himself toward oblivion. And then Morrison said something that Chen would replay in his mind thousands of times over the next 46 years. He said that if things went wrong in Paris, if the escape plan failed, if the darkness won after all, people should know that it wasn't really the end, because he'd been dead inside for years already, that the person who died would just be the body finally catching up to the soul that had expired somewhere between the whiskey, a go-go, and the Miami courthouse. He said that true death was becoming someone else's idea of you, and by that measure, Jim Morrison had died in 1967 when Light My Fire hit #1, and the real person got buried under the legend. Morrison stopped the recording, rewound the tape, played it back for himself while taking long pulls from a wine bottle, then carefully removed the tape from the machine and placed it inside his leather jacket. He sat there for another hour, not talking or reading, just drinking, and staring at Valentino's name carved into marble, and Chen had the distinct impression he was witnessing someone say goodbye to a friend, even if that friend was dead and had never known Morrison existed. When Morrison finally stood to leave, he did something he'd never done before. He reached out and touched the marble tomb, letting his hand rest on the cold stone for a long moment, then spoke one final sentence that Chen heard clearly in the silent cemetery. "Thanks for listening, brother. See you on the other side." That was Morrison's last visit to Hollywood Forever Cemetery. 3 days later, he flew to Paris with Pamela Courson. 16 weeks after that, he was dead in a bathtub at 17 Rue Beautreillis, officially from heart failure, though no autopsy was ever performed, and the circumstances remained murky with contradictions and unanswered questions. Chen learned about Morrison's death from the television news like everyone else, and he felt a strange personal grief for someone he'd never actually met, someone who'd never known he had a witness to his midnight confessions. He kept his notebooks, kept the secret, feeling somehow that revealing what he'd observed would be a violation of the strange sacred trust that had existed between him and the troubled poet who'd sought sanctuary among the dead. The tape Morrison recorded that final night, the goodbye message addressed to everyone and no one, was never found among his possessions in Paris. Whether Morrison destroyed it, lost it, or gave it to someone who still has it hidden away, remains one of the many mysteries surrounding his death. Chen sometimes wondered if Morrison had wanted the tape to be found, if recording it in the cemetery was meant to ensure that some version of his truth survived him, but then changed his mind in Paris, deciding that silence was better than explanation. Chen retired from Hollywood Forever Cemetery in 1985, his notebooks still packed away in boxes, their contents unknown to anyone but himself. He lived quietly in a small house in Pasadena with his wife Margaret, gardening and reading, and occasionally thinking about those strange years when Jim Morrison was his secret, when the most famous rock star in America came to the cemetery, where Chen worked and poured his heart out to a grave, while Chen watched and documented from the shadows. He told no one, not even Margaret, feeling obscurely that breaking the silence would somehow betray Morrison, even though Morrison was long dead and beyond caring about privacy or secrets. In 2016, at 91 years old, Chen suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and moved into his son's house for care. The Pasadena house was sold, and Chen's granddaughter Jessica, a journalism student at UCLA, helped pack up his belongings. In the garage, buried under old tools and boxes of Christmas decorations, Jessica found 3 water-stained notebooks filled with her grandfather's neat handwriting, dated entries spanning from October 1969 to March 1971, describing in meticulous detail the nocturnal visits of Jim Morrison to Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Jessica, who'd grown up hearing Doors songs and knew the basic outlines of the Morrison mythology, immediately recognized the historical significance of what she'd found. She brought the notebooks to her grandfather, who could still speak haltingly after the stroke, and asked him why he'd never told anyone. Chen's answer was simple. Not my story to tell. His pain, his privacy. I was just the witness. But Chen was dying. The stroke had made that clear, and he gave Jessica permission to share the notebooks after he was gone, feeling perhaps that enough time had passed, that the dead could have no objection to their secrets being known, that Morrison might even have approved of someone finally acknowledging the depth of his suffering. Robert Chen died on February 8, 2017, at the age of 92. 6 months later, Jessica published excerpts from his notebooks in a long-form article for a music history website, revealing for the first time Morrison's secret communion with Rudolph Valentino's grave, the desperate questions asked of marble and silence, the pattern of visits that documented Morrison's psychological deterioration in the final years of his life. The article went viral, shared by Morrison fans and music historians around the world, sparking renewed interest in Morrison's inner life and the toll that fame extracted from someone temperamentally unsuited to handle its demands. Hollywood Forever Cemetery confirmed that their security records from the early 1970s showed frequent after-hours intrusion alerts near the south fence that were logged as false alarms, lending credibility to Chen's account. The cemetery's current management installed a small plaque near Valentino's tomb, acknowledging Morrison's visits, a gesture that would probably have horrified Morrison, who'd sought the cemetery precisely because it was private and unknown, but which seemed fitting given how both men had struggled with the burden of being public property. The question Morrison asked Valentino hundreds of times during those midnight visits, "When does the fame stop hurting?" was never answered, at least not in any way that satisfied or saved him. Perhaps the answer is that it never stops, that fame of the intensity Morrison experienced is a wound that can't heal because it fundamentally changes how you exist in the world, makes authentic human connection nearly impossible, transforms you from a person into a symbol that other people project their fantasies and frustrations onto. Valentino found his escape in death at 31. Morrison found his at 27. Both left behind legacies that had almost nothing to do with who they actually were. And maybe that's the cruelest aspect of fame, that it preserves you forever as a lie while the truth dies with you. Chen's notebooks, now housed in the UCLA Music Archive, stand as testimony to a side of Jim Morrison that few people got to witness, the private person behind the Lizard King persona, lost and searching for answers in the only place where questions could be asked without performance or pretense. They remind us that behind every legendary figure is a human being struggling with fundamentally human problems, that fame solves nothing and often makes everything worse, that sometimes the price of being loved by millions is never being truly known by anyone.